Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. For 6 years, my wife and I lived in a foreign country. It was a country with no seasons, only the relentless, climate-controlled chill of recycled air. Its national anthem was the rhythmic, multi-layered chorus of beeping machines, and its language was a clipped, esoteric dialect of lab results, drug dosages, and whispered consultations in sterile hallways. Its flag was the pale, translucent plastic of an IV bag. We were not immigrants to this country by choice. We were refugees, driven there by a single, catastrophic event that had redrawn the map of our entire world. Our son, Milo, was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of leukemia when he was 4 years old. That was the day our old passports were stamped void. The pediatric oncology ward of St. Jude's became our new, permanent address. My name is Caleb, and before Milo's diagnosis, my life had been a fairly standard blueprint of suburban contentment. I was a civil engineer, a man who designed bridges, a profession I loved for its reassuring solidity, its predictable physics. I was married to Leona, a woman whose spirit was the exact opposite of a blueprint. She was a vibrant, spontaneous, and beautifully chaotic force of nature. Our life was comfortable, it was happy, it was ours. And then, in an instant, it wasn't. The 6 years that followed were a blur, a single, unbroken stretch of time that erased all sense of normal life. The hospital became our universe. Our marriage, which had been built on laughter and weekend trips and arguments about what to watch on Netflix, was reforged in the crucible of this new reality. It became a partnership, a strategic alliance against a relentless cellular enemy. We developed a routine, a battlefield rhythm. I was the logistician. I was the one who interfaced with the world outside the hospital walls. I kept my job, working remotely from cramped waiting rooms and quiet corridors, my laptop perched on my knees as I ran stress calculations on a bridge support while the sounds of a chemotherapy drip provided the soundtrack. I dealt with the insurance companies, a war of 1,000 tiny, soul-crushing battles fought over the phone. I managed our dwindling finances. I was the anchor, the one who tried to keep our small, battered ship tethered to some semblance of the real world. Leona, she was the front line. She was the heart of our small, 3-person army. She rarely left his side. She slept in the vinyl recliner that unfolded into a cot next to his bed, a chair designed for a level of discomfort that I am convinced was a form of passive torture for the parents. She learned the names of every nurse, the schedule of every medication, the subtle shifts in Milo's breathing that heralded a fever. She became a fluent speaker of the hospital's native tongue. Our love story was rewritten into a series of silent, exhausted gestures. It was me arriving at 3 a.m. with a fresh coffee for her and a clean pillowcase from home. It was her leaving a note in my laptop bag with the latest blood count numbers. We didn't have conversations, we had briefings. We didn't have date nights, we had shared, silent moments of terror in the family waiting room when a doctor would walk in with a grave expression. We were a perfect team. We were a machine, designed for the singular purpose of keeping our son alive. And in the strange, suspended reality of that world, we were closer than we had ever been. We were 2 soldiers in the same foxhole, sharing the same fear, the same desperate flickering hope. We saw other families in that foxhole. We saw them break. We saw marriages crumble under the immense, unendurable pressure. The grief and the fear would find the hairline fractures in their relationships and shatter them. But not us. We were solid. Our shared purpose had welded us together. Our love for Milo was the flux that made the bond unbreakable. We were Caleb and Leona, Milo's parents. It was the only identity we had left. And then the war ended. It ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, unbelievable series of clean scans. It ended with a doctor, a man whose face we had learned to read for the slightest hint of bad news, walking into the room with a smile that was so wide and so genuine it looked alien on his face. The word remission was spoken. Then, 6 months later, the word cured. It was a miracle, a statistical improbability, A victory so total and so unexpected that it felt less like a relief and more like a profound systemic shock. The day we walked out of St. Jude's for the last time with Milo, now a thin but vibrant 10-year-old walking between us, should have been the happiest day of our lives. But as the automatic glass door slid shut behind us, sealing off that world of beeping machines and sterile corridors, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of agoraphobia. We were leaving the country we had known for 6 years. We were being repatriated into a world we no longer recognized. The car ride home was silent. It was a silence that was completely different from the comfortable, exhausted silences of the hospital. That silence had been a shared space, a blanket we pulled over ourselves. This new silence was a vacuum. It was the absence of a shared purpose, the absence of the constant humming anxiety that had been the background music of our lives for so long. We were driving away from the battlefield, and we were realizing for the first time that we had forgotten how to be civilians. Our house felt like a museum of a life that belonged to other people. The air was thick with the dust of abandonment. Milo, our brave little soldier, was a stranger in his own home. He explored his old room with a cautious curiosity, touching toys he hadn't seen since he was a toddler. Leona and I just stood in the living room, surrounded by the artifacts of our past, the wedding photos, the vacation souvenirs, and we were two foreigners, unable to speak the local language. The weeks that followed were a slow, grinding attempt at re-entry. We tried to be normal. We had family dinners. We enrolled Milo back in school. I went back to the office, where the solid, predictable world of engineering felt like a comforting, if slightly alien dream. But the silence persisted. The machine of our partnership, so efficient in a crisis, had no peacetime function. We had forgotten how to talk about things that weren't a prognosis or a treatment plan. Our conversations were a series of logistical updates about Milo's school schedule or the grocery list. The shared trauma that had been our bond was now a chasm that lay between us. Leona was the one who seemed to be struggling the most. She was adrift. For 6 years, her entire identity had been Milo's mom, his caregiver, his advocate, his shield. Now that he was healthy, now that he was running around with school friends and complaining about homework, she was a soldier without a war. She would spend hours just sitting in his room, watching him sleep, as if she couldn't quite believe he was real, that he was safe. She still seemed to be living in the hospital, even though we were miles away. She would talk about the other families, the ones still in the foxhole. She had joined a support group, she said, for parents of children who had gone through critical illness. It was a way for her to process everything, to help others. I thought it was a wonderful idea. I saw it as a healthy, compassionate step towards her own healing. I encouraged her to go. I was glad she had found an outlet, a place where she could speak the language of that other country with people who understood. I didn't realize at the time that she wasn't just visiting that country. She was applying for permanent citizenship. The first time I noticed his name, it was just a fleeting data point, a text message on her phone that I saw by accident as she left it on the counter. A name I didn't recognize, Elias. The message was simple. Thinking of you. Hope today is a gentle one. I thought nothing of it. Elias. It was probably another parent from the support group, another veteran of the same war, checking in. It was a kind gesture. It was a sign of the supportive community she had found. It was, I told myself, a good thing. But the name kept appearing. There were late-night phone calls, quiet, hushed conversations she would take on the back porch, her silhouette framed against the dark glass of the kitchen door. When I would ask who it was, she would say, "Just Elias. His daughter is having a rough time with the chemo." And my heart would ache for this unseen family, for this man Elias and his sick daughter. I felt a sense of kinship with him, this stranger who was walking the same fiery path we had just escaped. I felt grateful that my wife, my compassionate, beautiful Leona, was able to offer him some small measure of comfort, the kind of comfort that can only come from someone who has been there. I was so busy feeling grateful that I failed to see the truth. I was so focused on the ghost of the illness we had defeated that I didn't see the new, living presence that was quietly and methodically taking my place. I was an engineer, a man trained to see structural flaws, to recognize when a foundation is compromised. And I was living in a house whose foundation had been completely eroded, and I was the last person to know. The silence in our home was no longer a vacuum. It was a presence. It was a secret. And I was about to find out that it had a name. The silence in our home began to take on a new texture. It was no longer the empty, echoing silence of two people who had forgotten how to speak to one another. It was a dense, weighted silence, the kind that actively suffocates sound. It was the silence of a secret being kept. Leona was receding from me, day by day, like a tide going out, leaving behind a vast, empty stretch of beach where our life together used to be. She was physically present, but her spirit, her essence, was somewhere else. She moved through our home with the distracted, ethereal air of a visitor, her thoughts clearly residing in that other country, the one with the beeping machines and the hushed, urgent conversations. The support group became her sanctuary. She would attend meetings 3-4 times a week. She would come home late, smelling of hospital antiseptic and stale coffee, her eyes carrying a strange mixture of profound sadness and a kind of luminous, energized purpose. I tried to be the supportive husband. I would ask about the meetings, about the families. "How was Elias's daughter doing?" I would ask, my voice full of genuine, if misplaced, compassion. Her answers were always vague, her eyes averted. "It's hard," she would say. "Anja is a fighter, but it's very hard." Anja? So the daughter had a name. The faceless tragedy now had a name, and it made the story feel even more real, more deserving of my sympathy. Leona started a new ritual. She would spend hours in the small spare bedroom we had, the one that had become a storage room for Milo's old outgrown baby things. She told me she was turning it into a meditation space, a place where she could process the difficult emotions from the support group. She kept the door closed. She asked me to respect her privacy there, and I did. I saw it as another step in her healing. I was a fool. I was a blind, trusting fool who was actively helping his wife build the very sanctuary where she was betraying him. The evidence of my foolishness accumulated slowly, a series of small, seemingly insignificant anomalies that my tired, grief-worn brain refused to connect. There was the extra blanket that disappeared from the linen closet, the one she said she had donated to a shelter. There was the new, expensive brand of coffee in the pantry, a dark, oily roast she knew I disliked, which she claimed a friend from the group had given her. There was the day I found a man's gray wool scarf tucked deep in the pocket of her winter coat, a scarf she swore she had found on the bus and was planning to turn in to Lost and Found. Each of these was a single, discordant note in the symphony of our life. On their own, they were nothing, but together they were beginning to form a quiet, dissonant chord of wrongness. The breaking point, the moment the music stopped and the terrible, deafening silence of the truth rushed in, was a Tuesday. It was Milo's 11th birthday. It was a milestone, a triumphant celebration of the life we had fought so hard for. We had a small party, just a few of his school friends. Leona was a perfect hostess, a radiant, smiling mother, but I could see the strain behind her eyes. She seemed to be performing a role, the role of the happy, grateful mother, and it was a role that no longer fit. Later that evening, after Milo was asleep, after the happy chaos of the party had subsided, Leona told me she was going out. "There's an emergency meeting at the hospital," she said, her voice low and somber. "It's Anja. She's taken a turn for the worse. Elias is falling apart. I have to be there." I felt a familiar pang of sympathy. Poor man. Poor little girl. "Of course," I said. "Go, be with him. Is there anything I can do?" She shook her head, her eyes full of a sorrow that I thought was for him, for Anja. "No," she whispered. "You've done enough." She kissed me on the cheek, a quick, cool, dry kiss,
and then she was gone. I was left alone in the house, surrounded by the debris of a child's birthday party. For some reason, her last words echoed in my head. "You've done enough." It was a strange thing to say. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat down in the living room, trying to push the unease away. That's when I saw it. On the floor, partially hidden under the sofa, was her phone. She had left in such a hurry, she had forgotten it. My first thought was to call her, to let her know she'd left it. But she was at the hospital in an emergency. I shouldn't bother her. I picked it up, intending to put it on the charger for her. But as I held it, the screen lit up with a new notification. It was a text message from Elias. The message read, "I'm here. The wine is chilled. I can't believe she's finally asleep. I have you all to myself tonight." I read the message once, then twice, then a third time. My brain, the engineer's brain, tried to process the data. It was a string of words. Words have meanings. But these words, in this context, refused to resolve into any logical, coherent reality. The wine is chilled? I have you all to myself? He wasn't at the hospital with his dying daughter. He was somewhere else, somewhere with wine, and he was waiting for my wife. And she was asleep? Anja? No, that didn't make sense. The thought hit me with the force of a physical impact, a punch to the gut that knocked all the air from my lungs. Anja wasn't a sick little girl in a hospital bed. Anja was his wife, and Leona was not on her way to a hospital to comfort a grieving friend. She was on her way to a tryst with her lover. The last 6 months of my life, of her life, replayed in my mind in a dizzying, sickening flash. The support group, the late-night calls, the meditation room, the blanket, the coffee, the scarf. They were not anomalies. They were evidence. Evidence of a second, secret life she had been living, a life of which I was not a part. The grief she had been carrying, the sorrow that seemed to distance her from me, it wasn't just for the past, for the war we had won. It was for the present, for the new war she was watching her lover fight. She had found a man whose tragedy mirrored the one we had just escaped. She had found a man who still lived in that foreign country of beeping machines, a man who still spoke its language. She had found a man who understood her in a way that I, with my healthy, vibrant living son, no longer could. Her betrayal was not a simple, sordid affair. It was something far more complex, far more tragic, and in a way, far more cruel. She had not left me for a better life. She had left me for a better grief. I sat there, in the silent, party-strewn house for a very long time, the phone heavy in my hand like a piece of dead, cold stone. The anger came, a hot, blinding wave of it, but it was followed by something else, something heavier and more profound. It was a feeling of immense, desolate sorrow. Our marriage hadn't been destroyed by a betrayal. Our marriage had died in that hospital, and I just hadn't been brave enough to sign the death certificate. The support group, the secret life with Elias, these were just the opportunistic infections that had taken root in an already dead host. I had to know. I had to see the full scope of the life she had built in the ruins of ours. I went to the spare bedroom, to her meditation space. The door was locked. I had never tried to open it before. I went to my toolbox and came back with a screwdriver. The lock was cheap, simple. It popped open with a quiet, pathetic click. I opened the door and turned on the light. The room was not a meditation space. It was an archive. It was a museum. It was a shrine. But it was not a shrine to our life, to Milo, to the battle we had won. The walls were covered in photographs, not of my son, but of a small, frail, bald little girl with huge, dark, sad eyes, Anja. There were medical charts on a small desk detailing her treatment protocols. There was a small box on the shelf containing a lock of her hair. And there was a journal lying open on the desk. It was Leona's handwriting. It was a detailed, emotional account of the last year. But it was not about us. It was about them. About her and Elias and Anja. It was a story of their shared vigils, their whispered conversations, their moments of shared hope and despair. I was a footnote in the story, a peripheral character, referred to as Caleb, the well-meaning but emotionally distant husband who just couldn't understand. I closed the journal. I looked around the room, at this meticulously curated collection of another family's tragedy, and I finally understood. I had not lost my wife to another man. I had lost her to another family's grief. She had found a new war to fight because she had forgotten how to live in peace. And in this new war, I was not her ally. I was a civilian, a casualty, an outsider who was no longer fluent in the only language she knew how to speak anymore. Standing in that secret room, that museum of a stranger's sorrow, was like being in the epicenter of a silent explosion. The blast wave didn't shatter glass or tear down walls. It radiated inward, shattering the very foundation of the man I thought I was and the life I thought I had. I was not a husband in a troubled marriage. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a story that was not my own. I looked at the photograph of the sick little girl, Anja, her eyes vast and full of a weary wisdom, and I felt a profound, aching sadness for her father, Elias, and even, in a strange, twisted way, for Leona. My wife was not a monster. She was not a cold, calculating adulterer. She was a broken soldier suffering from a unique and terrible form of shell shock. She had spent 6 years in the trenches, and when the war ended, she had discovered that the only place she felt alive was back on the battlefield. She was addicted to the crisis, to the high-stakes, life-and-death emotional intensity of the hospital. And our peaceful, normal life, the very thing we had fought so hard to reclaim, was a quiet, suburban hell to her. It was a world devoid of the meaning and purpose she had found in the crucible of her son's illness. Elias and his daughter were not her lovers. They were her fix. They were her access back into the only world where she still knew who she was. This understanding did not dilute the pain of her betrayal, but it changed its chemical composition. The hot, simple anger was gone, replaced by a cold, complex grief. I was mourning not just the loss of my wife, but the loss of the woman she had been, the woman who had been vaporized in the slow, radioactive decay of our son's illness. The woman who stood in her place was a stranger, a ghost, who just happened to be wearing my wife's face. My first instinct, the primal male instinct, was to confront her, to wait for her to come home from her tryst and to throw the contents of this secret room at her feet, to scream, to rage, to force a reckoning. I imagined the scene, the predictable, ugly drama of it all. The denials, then the tearful confessions, the accusations, the justifications. It would be a messy, brutal, and ultimately pointless demolition. It would achieve nothing but the creation of more wreckage, more trauma. And then I thought of Milo, my beautiful, brave, healthy son, asleep in his room down the hall, dreaming the peaceful, untroubled dreams I had fought so hard to give him. He had earned his peace. A new battle, a domestic war fought with slammed doors and shouted accusations, was a trauma I would not, could not, inflict upon him. His healing was more important than my rage. His stability was more important than my need for vindication. My love for him was the one, true, uncompromised thing left in the wreckage of my life. And that love demanded a different course of action. I would not have a confrontation. I would not have a war. I would conduct a quiet, controlled demolition. I would dismantle our life together with the same silent, methodical precision she had used to build her secret one. I left the room exactly as I had found it. I closed the door. I re-engaged the cheap, pathetic lock. I went back downstairs and cleaned up the remains of Milo's birthday party. I put her phone back on the charger. I erased the text message from Elias. I wiped away every trace of my discovery. When she came home hours later, in the dead of night, She found me asleep on the sofa, a book open on my chest. I was the picture of the trusting, oblivious husband, too tired to make it up to bed. She looked down at me, and in the dim light from the hallway, I saw the flicker of guilt and pity in her eyes. It was the last time I would ever see her look at me that way. The next morning, I initiated my plan. It was a plan built not on anger, but on a kind of radical, surgical detachment. I called a lawyer, a man who specialized in quiet, uncontested divorces for high net worth individuals. I told him I wanted to dissolve my marriage as quickly and as cleanly as possible. I told him I wanted only two things: full custody of my son and the house. Everything else, the savings, the investments, my own retirement accounts, she could have. It was not an act of generosity. It was a transaction. It was severance pay. It was the price I was willing to pay to avoid a war, to protect my son from the shrapnel. For the next 2 weeks, I lived a lie of extraordinary discipline. I was a ghost in my own home, performing the functions of a husband while methodically severing every tie that bound me to Leona. I went through our shared possessions, sorting them into 2 categories, his and hers. I did it at night while she was at her support meetings. I packed her clothes into expensive suitcases I bought for the purpose. I gathered her books, her art supplies, the artifacts of the woman I had once known, and I packed them into boxes. The house began to feel less like a home and more like an estate sale in progress. She noticed the changes, of course. She saw the new suitcases in the closet, the empty spaces on the bookshelves. But she misinterpreted them. She saw them through the lens of her own guilt. She assumed I was withdrawing, retreating into a depression caused by my work stress and our growing emotional distance. She saw my quiet activity as a symptom of my sadness, not as the logistics of my departure. She was so consumed by her own secret life that she was blind to the complete deconstruction of our shared one happening right in front of her. The most difficult part was telling Milo. I did not tell him the truth about his mother. That would have been an act of unforgivable cruelty. Instead, I told him a different kind of truth.
I sat him down in the living room, the room where we had celebrated his birthday just 2 weeks before, and I told him that sometimes when people go through something really hard, like we had, it changes them. It changes them so much that they can't live together in the same way anymore. I told him that his mother and I loved him more than anything in the world, and that would never change, but that we were going to live in 2 different houses now. He was a child who had lived with the specter of death for most of his life. He understood the concept of profound, irreversible change better than most adults. He was sad, but he was also resilient. He looked at me with his wise old eyes, the eyes of a child who had seen too much, and he nodded. "As long as I still have you, Dad," he said, "it's okay." That sentence was the only absolution I would ever need. The final day was a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after my discovery. I had packed the last of her things. Her new apartment, a place I had rented and paid for a year in advance, was ready for her. My lawyer had the divorce papers prepared. Everything was in place. She came home that evening from another meeting. She was tired, distracted, her mind clearly still at the hospital with Elias and his daughter. She walked into the living room and stopped. The room was different. All of her personal belongings, her favorite throw blanket, the stacks of art magazines, the small clay sculptures she had made, were gone. In their place, on the coffee table, was a single sealed manila envelope, her car keys, and one of the new, expensive suitcases. She looked at me, her face a mask of utter confusion. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "What's going on?" I did not shout. I did not cry. I did not list her sins. I simply looked at her, and for the first time, I let her see the full, unvarnished truth in my eyes. I let her see the man who knew everything. "I think you have a new support group to get to, Leona," I said, my voice calm, quiet, and utterly final. "All of your things have been moved to your new apartment. The address is in the envelope, along with the signed divorce papers and a cashier's check that should be more than enough to get you started. Milo is asleep. I suggest you go now, before he wakes up." She stared at me,
her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The truth, delivered not with a roar, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of an engineer's report, had left her speechless. She was looking at a stranger, a man she had never known I was capable of being. There were no arguments to be made. There were no defenses to be mounted. I had not opened a debate. I had simply closed a chapter. She stood there for a long moment, the color draining from her face. Then, without a word, she picked up the envelope and the suitcase. She did not look at me again. She walked out the front door, the door to the house we had bought together, the house where we had raised our son, the house where we had fought a war and won. And she did not look back. I listened to the sound of her car starting, the sound of it driving away, until it faded into the quiet suburban night. The silence that filled the house now was different. It was not the silence of secrets. It was not the silence of a vacuum. It was a clean, quiet, empty silence. It was the silence of a site that has been cleared, ready for a new foundation to be laid. The demolition was complete. The days immediately following Leona's departure were a study in absence. The house felt vast, cavernous, every empty space a testament to the life that was no longer there. I walked through the rooms like an inspector surveying a completed demolition site, noting the structural integrity of what remained. What remained was me and Milo. We were the foundation. Everything else had been superficial, cosmetic, and had been stripped away. The temptation, I think, for a man in my position is to immediately try to fill the void, to find a new relationship, to create a new noise that can drown out the echoes of the old one. But my training, my very nature as an engineer, is to first understand the site, to analyze the soil, to ensure the ground is stable before you even think about drawing up a new blueprint. Milo and I entered a period of quiet, deliberate reconstruction. Our life became a series of small, solid, dependable rituals. We had breakfast together every morning. I would make him pancakes, and he would tell me about his dreams, real dreams now, dreams of superheroes and video games, not the fevered, pain-filled nightmares of the hospital. I would walk him to school, and in the afternoons, I would be there when he got home. I rearranged my entire professional life around this new, singular priority. I took a step back at my firm, handing off the big, time-consuming projects to my partners. I took a pay cut. I became the man who left at 3 p.m. every day. My colleagues probably thought my wife's departure had broken me, that I was a man in retreat. They were wrong. I was not retreating. I was advancing, but on a different front. I was pouring all the energy I had once dedicated to building bridges out of concrete and steel into building a new, stronger bridge to my son. We talked, really talked, for the first time in years. In the crucible of the hospital, our conversations had been about pain levels and medication side effects. Now we talked about everything and nothing. We talked about space, about dinosaurs, about why the girl in his class, Sarah, was suddenly ignoring him. I was not just his logistician anymore. I was his father. And I was discovering, with a sense of quiet, profound wonder, that it was the most complex, most challenging, and most rewarding engineering project of my life. I did not speak of Leona, and for a long time, neither did he. He knew she had moved out. He knew he would see her on weekends. But he also seemed to understand, with the quiet wisdom of a child who has been forced to grow up too fast, that the core of his world, the load-bearing structure of his life, was now this house, with me in it. Leona, from a distance, seemed to be drifting. The generous settlement I had given her meant she didn't have to work. According to the occasional polite email she would send regarding Milo's schedule, she was focusing on her healing. I knew what that meant. She was free now to fully immerse herself in the world of Elias and his daughter. She was no longer a visitor to that country of grief. She was a full-time resident. I did not hate her for it. The anger, the rage, had been a temporary structural stress. Once the compromised element, our marriage, had been removed, the stress had dissipated. What was left was a kind of deep, impersonal sadness. She was a casualty of the same war that had almost taken our son. The disease had taken her too, just in a different way. The first time I saw them together was about 6 months after she had left. I was at the city's botanical garden with Milo on a Saturday afternoon. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn day, and across a small, manicured lawn I saw her. She was sitting on a bench with a man, and a young girl in a wheelchair was beside them, a colorful blanket tucked around her legs. It was them, Elias and Anja. Leona looked different. She was thinner, and she had cut her vibrant, chaotic hair short. She was looking at Anja with an expression of such intense, focused, and sorrowful devotion that it was almost painful to watch. She was a nurse, a mother, a caregiver. She was performing the role that had become her entire identity. Elias looked tired, a man worn down to the bone by the relentless, grinding reality of his daughter's illness. They were not a couple in the throes of a passionate, romantic affair. They looked like what they were, two exhausted soldiers huddled together for warmth in a trench that had no end. They did not see me. I took Milo's hand and quietly led him down a different path. And as we walked away, I felt not a flicker of jealousy or anger. I felt a strange, profound sense of closure. I was looking at a photograph of a life that was and could never be mine. I was an outsider, a foreigner to their specific, shared tragedy. And for the first time, I was grateful for it. My life with my son was not defined by a shared grief. It was defined by a shared survival. We were moving forward, towards the light. They were trapped in a perpetual twilight present, their lives defined by the thing they were about to lose. The final piece of the reconstruction fell into place about a year after the separation. I was at Milo's parent-teacher conference. His teacher, a warm, intelligent woman named Sarah, the mother of the girl who had been ignoring him, was telling me about what a remarkable, resilient, and kind boy he was. And as I sat there, listening to her talk about my son, I saw not just a teacher, but a woman. A woman whose smile was genuine, whose eyes were not haunted by the ghosts of a hospital ward. We talked for a long time, about our children, about our lives. I learned she was a single mother, a widow. She spoke of loss, but her loss was a scar, not a constant open wound. It was a part of her history, not the entirety of her present. We had coffee the next week, and then dinner the week after that. It was slow, it was tentative. It was the careful, cautious work of two engineers surveying a new site, testing the ground, checking the foundations before daring to build anything new. There was no grand cinematic passion. There was something quieter and, in its own way, far more solid. There was the easy comfort of a shared understanding, the quiet joy of a conversation that did not revolve around a tragedy. I was learning a new language again, but this was not the language of the hospital. It was the simple, beautiful, and sometimes awkward language of a normal life. I did not forget Leona. I did not erase the years we had spent together, the war we had fought. It is a part of my design, a part of the history of the structure that is me. But it is not the whole structure. It is the old foundation, buried deep beneath the ground, a testament to a building that once stood there. But the house I live in now, the life I am building now with my son, and perhaps with Sarah, is a new design. It is stronger, it is more honest, and it is built not to withstand a war, but to celebrate the quiet, beautiful, and sometimes difficult miracle of peace. Thank you for tuning in to Reddit Whispers. We've all faced moments when everything felt broken. What was your turning point? Leave it in the comments because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.